Hello, Dan here again with Ellie Wilson. The next video we're going to go over is the 223 regular case gauge or cartridge case gauge. There's two things that this gauge measures. It measures min-max headspace on your cases according to SAMI spec. The outside is the maximum step for headspace. The groove in the middle is a 5 thousandths groove for minimum headspace. On the other end of the gauge, you have maximum case length, which again is the outside, and minimum case length, which is the middle groove, and that's a 10 thousandths groove on this end. There's a few different ways to use the gauge, but first, before you do anything, you want to make sure you wipe it off and get all the debris, the shipping oil that we put on there, and get all that off of there so it's nice and clean. But the Ellie Wilson preferred method is to take one of your fired cases out of your gun and have a starting point or a basis for all your measurements. In this case, this came out of an AR-15. This is one of the most common questions we get here on the phone, so I thought I'd go over it. After the gauge is all clean, take your case, plunk it into the gauge, and you can see by using a straight edge or a ruler, if I run this over the maximum step, I'm actually running in to the edge of the case. So that's telling me that my chamber is a little larger than SAMI spec. Most cases and most other guns will sit right at maximum or somewhere thereabouts. Semi-automatics tend to sit a little bit higher just because chambers tend to be larger on those particular guns. There's a couple different ways I can measure this. I could take a depth mic and try to get a reading from the top of the head to the top of the gauge to give me a measurement of how far I'm sitting over the top of the gauge or how far over maximum I am. I like to use a nice pair of calipers with a nice flat edge on them, and you can measure the gauge. 1.760 is how long the gauge is. And if I pull a measurement off, don't measure off the primer, but off the edge of the case and get as flat as you can and measure to the maximum, I get 1.68. Excuse me, 1.768. So that's telling me that my case is sitting 8 thousandths above the top of the gauge, or over maximum SAMI spec. Perfectly normal. You can still use this to determine how to set your full-length die. So I took my case and I sized it at the recommended setting with this particular case, and now as you can see, I don't touch it on the maximum and I'm not touching it on the minimum. So I know that I've at least sized it the 5 thousandths plus the 8 thousandths. It was sitting over the gauge, so I know I've got 13 thousandths there that I've sized at least. It's probably sitting, I can feel a little lip here, maybe another thousandths deeper than that. And you can actually use a depth mic on there, and I get 6 thousandths. I don't know if you can see that, but I get 6 thousandths, which tells me from the max down to the min is 5, so it's another thousandths. So I sized my case from this one to this one 14 thousandths. That really shows you the importance of the case gauge and why you need to use this. You only want on an AR 3 to 4 thousandths of size. On a bolt gun, a couple of thousandths, sometimes 1 thousandths is all it will take to get that case to chamber. So I adjusted my full-length die and I sized another case. Now when I slide on the maximum, I still touch the case. I'm over maximum at this point with my sized case. So I know the gauge is, again, 1.760, and if I take a measurement off the head of the case down to the other end of the gauge, I get 1.764. I'm 4 thousandths over maximum. I have this set up now perfectly for my cases out of my gun. I'm sizing them back 4 thousandths. You may do all this and still have an issue with cases jamming. If that's a problem, on an AR the most likely solution is to get a small base die and take this diameter down here by the head. But the other portion I wanted to talk about, the other part of the gauge, is this does not measure any body diameters. It doesn't do what the pistol max gauge does, but what this gauge does is it gives you an accurate reading shoulder to head, because this is oversized on the body of the gauge, and that's the same reason we slightly oversize the neck. Most of the time, if you're pushing your shoulder back enough, like on this case, about 4 thousandths, that case will chamber without any issue in your gun. That's not always the case. You may have to add the small base die, but most of the time that is the case. The other thing you can do is, if you have a batch of cases, you can take them and separate them out into 3 different piles. So if you buy a batch of military brass, or if you pick up some brass at the range, you can take those cases, drop them in the gauge, and separate into overmax, in between min and max, and at minimum. So when you go to size those cases, you're going to get a more consistent size, and you're going to have confidence that those rounds will chamber. A slight difference from an 8 thousandths above max case to a case that's already between the min max, when you run it through the dies, they're going to react differently. That's another way to use the gauge. A lot of people will take the gauge and just to check loaded rounds, they'll see if they sized them at the end. But I think the best way is to take one of your fired cases again and take the measurements, do your sizing, make the adjustments, and go from there. And it doesn't hurt to, after you've done 100 of them, check, every 20 or 30 or whatever it is, and make sure that your die, your sizing die, didn't move on you, or if there's another issue in there. But that is the Wilson cartridge case gauge. I hope that answers a lot of questions out there, and there'll be more videos to come. Thanks for watching.